Hello, Jeremy. Good morning. A really interesting article that you've written about Ming Yang's potential investment in Scotland and some of the national security concerns. I think you raised like a number of sort of really interesting questions. I think that it's the sort of the intersection of problems that I think is particularly of a challenge, isn't it? About how we can achieve kind of the big goals and the sort of the trade and foreign investment at the same time as sort of protecting kind of national security, which I think is kind of the heart of the thing, and that's what is so complicated, isn't it? I suppose just as a start, I mean, how concerned should people be about Chinese involvement in wind turbine manufacturing? Right, it feels like wind turbines. Surely they're just big things that go around in the sky. What is the harm that could do? Shouldn't we just be happy that Ming Yang's happy to invest in sort of local factory and make local jobs?
Well, I think your question strikes at the heart of a dilemma which the UK faces, but not only the UK, which is how do you deal with those two things at the same time? One, the benefits that Chinese manufacturers of wind turbines, and by the way, also electric vehicles and solar panels and the whole green renewables ecosystem, how do we deal with the fact that there are enormous benefits that come from China's proven expertise and dominance of the green industries, with the fact that in certain cases, in certain technologies, there are security risks embedded in the technology. And the reason I say that, and to preempt anybody saying to me, when was an offshore wind turbine last hacked? The fact is, it is happening already. If you know anything about cybersecurity, you will know that since 2022, in particular, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the geopolitical fallout, there's been an enormous rise in cyber hacking. But it isn't really just about that. It's about something more problematic, probably, which is the fact that wherever you have digital technology embedded in renewable technology, you have the potential for its use or misuse if a state actor standing behind it intends to use this for economic coercion. And that's where China comes in. And there are people who may say, well, this is a rather alarmist fantasy, actually. Why would China want to do that? And by the way, has it happened yet? And the answer is no, it hasn't happened yet, but it has happened in other contexts. And as I allude to in my piece that you very kindly are running, um, not very long ago, Lithuania found itself at loggerheads with China over um, Taiwan, and the Chinese removed Lithuania from its customs database, meaning that no exports could go from Lithuania to China at a stroke. And it was a pretty shocking sign of what China is capable of doing if it wants to send a signal that it is not pleased with the particular policy stance of a country that it is dealing with. And we have to remember that we are in an extremely febrile geopolitical era now. I think nobody in the offshore wind industry could possibly deny that. And we need to be very clear eyed about the world we are in. And we also need to be clear eyed about what economic levers and other levers Beijing could exercise in a situation where we may get into a very adversarial relationship with China. And the final point is, I just want to stress, this is not about Ming Yang Smart Energy doing something bad to the UK or doing something bad to the ScotWind project. It's not about Ming Yang. It's about the Chinese Communist Party instructing Ming Yang to do a certain thing. That's the key point here, because it is acknowledged that Ming Yang is a very successful company, has expanded very rapidly, has a pretty decent reputation, I understand. So I think these are the key points that people need to bear in mind.
A number of really interesting areas you've raised there, Jeremy. I suppose just sort of just to sort of maybe sort of start at the sort of the higher level. I mean, I think so thinking about sort of Chinese, I suppose, is it aggressiveness? Is it assertiveness? Is it becoming a more of an activist actor, I suppose, in the world stage in terms of taking action, as you say, things like sort of debates around Taiwan. Do you think that it's becoming more interested in sort of intervening around the world?
Yes, without question. You just have to read any of the national security reviews that the UK has done recently to see that, or indeed any other country, Western country. You also need to look at their actions in the South China Sea. For those who have been following it, and I would actually urge anybody in the offshore wind industry to actually follow this stuff because it is relevant. It may not seem relevant to your world as you're trying to figure out, where do we put our supply chain? I mean, it may not seem relevant to people in the offshore wind sector in Scotland, what China is doing in the South China Sea, but it actually is extremely telling in terms of the behavior of this state actor globally. I mean, I'll just pick one random thing. If you've been following what happened between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy in the disputed area between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea earlier on this year, that was extremely concerning and unprecedentedly aggressive behavior on the part of China. There's a reason for this. China is quite naturally, a rising power, and they see that part of the world as their neighborhood, and they want the US out, basically, and they don't particularly like that its allies had the position that they do. In the case of Europe, I mean, China is quite keen for Europe not to be united. It's much easier to deal with a divided Europe. It's one of the reasons why they went after Lithuania in the way that they did. You see this time and time again. And what's interesting in the UK context is that China, which has a track record of exploiting differences within sovereign countries in terms of their regional governance, by which I mean in the UK case, a devolved setup. China is very used to exploiting the differences within a country's governance setup to its advantage. It's no accident that the Chinese consulate in Edinburgh has more diplomats than any other of the foreign consulates here. China is very interested in Scotland, and it's not simply because it wants to support commercial activities and educational activities. There is a broader strategic, tactical interest here, I think.
Looking at it from the other side, I mean, I think obviously we've got, the government has recently published its sort of 2030 clean action plan, and obviously offshore wind and solar, as you mentioned, are going to play kind of key parts in that. Can we achieve those big goals without, I mean, bargain priced, essentially, sort of Chinese equipment? I think, I think there is a sort of a there's a lot of sort of control about sort of about sort of inflation in the wind turbine kind of area, but it feels like companies like Ming Yang can offer big bits of kit at prices that are extremely
Absolutely. It's unarguable that there is a commercially compelling offering from Chinese wind turbine manufacturers, whether it's Ming Yang or Goldwind or Sany, whoever it may be. And of course, if you're a developer, you've got shareholders. You've got your bottom line, your top line. And it is quite natural and understandable that people would be interested in engaging with a company like Ming Yang. This is completely reasonable and understandable, as I said. But this gets to the dilemma that we face as a country. This whole issue cannot and should not be decided by the developers, nor even by the Scottish government, which is only interested in the commercial aspects of this arrangement. And by that I mean the Scottish government is only interested because it doesn't have responsibility for energy and energy security, which is reserved to Westminster. The Scottish government's only really interested in facilitating commercial discussions between the developer community and supply chain companies like Ming Yang. And that is completely reasonable, which is one of the reasons why you saw Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, visiting the Inchcape wind farm the other day to congratulate them on this new money that is being put into by Forth Ports into Port of Leith for the build out of offshore wind capability, which eventually will help, I think, Vestas, Ming Yang's European competitor, come to a decision over whether they really will build a wind turbine factory in Leith, which I think is now looking quite likely. So the Scottish government's priority is, quite reasonably, to build out and support the offshore wind supply chain. They don't have to think about these unpleasant aspects of this to do with security and geopolitics. There is one other aspect of this which I talk about, and which I think is relevant, which has nothing to do with security. which is this idea that Chinese wind turbine manufacturers are under investigation by the European Union for alleged unfair subsidies, as many people will know. We're now in the 8th month of that investigation. So, and in the United States, under Biden, and it will be even worse under Trump, Chinese renewable companies will face tariffs. So there is an intense antitrust scrutiny on Chinese renewable companies, including wind turbine manufacturers. Guess what? The UK isn't a member of the European Union anymore. So we don't have that policy stance. In fact, if you look at the G7 group of countries, we are an outlier in terms of our whole trade and tariff policy approach to Chinese wind turbine manufacturers. So it is extremely convenient for Mingyang to have chosen the UK for its European beachhead. And you might say, fair dues, good on them. But it poses a challenge for the UK, which is, are we at a time of geopolitical fracture and where we need to be thinking carefully about where our interests are aligned? What message does it send to our G7 allies that we may be on the point of letting in China's largest offshore wind turbine manufacturer into our market when the rest of the G7 has a completely different policy towards this? And this could backfire on the UK, I think, because if you think about what happened with Huawei, it was American pressure that forced the UK government to strip Huawei out of its plans to embed it in the network here in the UK. Because the Americans saw what the Brits were doing and they were like, guys, seriously? So what we want, this is where I think the UK government has to think carefully about this, because there are unintended consequences of not joining the dots and having proper line of sight on what's happening. And I think I don't see any evidence that the UK government is thinking about it. If it is, it's all secret squirrel stuff that we don't know about. Let's hope they're talking about it.
So just to sort of round things off, and in the interest of a sort of a quick short answer, what should the government be thinking about if it was to say, look, yeah, we sort of recognize this as a problem. What sort of things would be a way to find some sort of a middle way between saying, look, we need this equipment to accomplish our goals, but at the same time we're worried about potential sort of state interference? What does that middle way look like?
So in the last few weeks, the European Union pointed the way towards this. They said that they were going to require Chinese renewables companies to do technology transfer as a condition of entry into the EU to set up manufacturing facilities. I thought that was very interesting. It shows that there is a way to exercise some leverage in this situation. To put it another way, you might think that because China is and Chinese wind turbine manufacturers are so economically compelling, that we have no leverage in this at all. I don't think that's true. The Chinese need our markets because they have excess industrial and manufacturing capacity that they're desperately trying to export around the world. That is why you see so many Chinese manufacturing companies in renewables setting up all over the world. They've got to get rid of this stuff somehow because they have a domestic economic problem that they need to solve. So I think that if you accept the commercial inevitability of Mingyang in your offshore wind supply chain in Scotland, and there are many people who would say, yes, you should accept that, you can turn around and say, well, let's put some good conditions on this because you need our market, don't you? And it's true, they do. So I think you've put some sort of conditionality on it. I'm not a technical person and I'm not a lawyer, so it's up to those guys to figure this out. But what you might think of doing is having some kind of ring fencing of the technology, some safeguarding of the technology, some other conditionality that you would put on this as part of a negotiation. Number two, this helps to align you with what the European Union is doing in its approach, policy-wise. And given where the Labour government is now in making nice with Brussels, which personally I think is a very good thing, this is another added ingredient that the UK can bring to the table to bring together the UK and the European Union in a policy approach that can only be helpful as we deal with China together.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Jeremy, thanks very much for taking some time to talk us through it. And please do go and read Jeremy's article. It's on E-FWD right now. Thanks very much.